Alrighty, thank you everybody for joining me on today's episode of Lanesplitter. Today we're going to be looking at the 2021 Royal Enfield Continental GT650. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but this bike was loaned to me by my best friend, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to check it out. I want to start off this review by talking just a little bit about who should actually buy this bike. You're probably at least slightly familiar with Royal Enfields, and if you are, you know that they're built to a budget. This GT650 comes in at just above $6,500 brand new, which immediately puts it into the budget-friendly beginner category. But is it really a good beginner bike, and is it really a good bike at all? For my piece, I'll save you the suspense. Yeah, it's a great beginner bike. Its 648cc parallel twin produces acclaimed 47 horsepower and 31 pound-feet of torque, all directed through a 6-speed sequential box at your left foot. It's definitely a bit more powerful than other conventional beginner bikes in the 300 category, like the Ninja 400 and things like that, but that power is produced by a pretty mellow engine. This thing redlines at 7,500 RPMs, and let me tell you, it does not reward you for revving it all the way out. One thing you'll notice when you first step onto the GT is its throttle response. Even in the higher gears, closing the throttle abruptly will result in some sort of bucking, and if you do the same in first or second, you're going to be thrown forward pretty hard. That being said, the throttle is easy to modulate, and after a short adjustment period, I don't know, maybe an hour or so, maybe a little less, that jerkiness is pretty easy to avoid by just being a little bit easier on the throttle than you might otherwise be. However, being that this is a beginner bike, it is maybe not the best thing in the world to have such an abrupt throttle. As I pull away from the stoplight, and actually I'm gonna open up the throttle a little bit, gotta get past these cars. You can see that despite its slightly lazy engine, the GT has more than enough passing power for surface roads. And as we come to a stop here, I found neutral pretty readily this time around, but it can, at times, take a few tries to actually get into neutral. And it's really my one complaint about this gearbox. Otherwise, it's got a pretty nice short throw, it's usually pretty easy to tell when it's clicked into gear, and it's just overall pretty easy to get along with. And as we head over these train tracks, it seems like a good time to mention the suspension. The front 41mm forks are completely non-adjustable, and the rear twin shocks are only adjustable for preload. As with most things on this bike, they're not what you'd call premium components. However, they do soak up the bumps pretty nicely, and they keep you comfortable at just about any speed. I'll talk a bit more about the bike's handling characteristics as we head towards a faster and twistier road, but for now, just know that this is a much more comfort-oriented bike than a sport-oriented one. Cruising along this side road, you can see that I'm sitting just about 4,000 RPMs at 50 and in 4th gear. And this is actually where this bike is happiest. It's well within its power band and nowhere near the top of its rev range. As I said before, this is a pretty lazy engine. It'll cruise all day at this speed, and it'll even pretty happily go up to about 80, but pushing it past there, quickly it becomes clear that that's not what this motorcycle wants you to do with it. Another thing to talk about on that subject, actually, is wind protection. The Enfield has none, and even 50 miles per hour like we're going right now can be pretty brutally windy. Around town and on shorter jaunts, it's no problem, but just be aware that this is not a touring bike. Longer journeys, especially here in windy Colorado, will be physically tiring to complete. From that longer journey perspective, my experience with this bike has had me getting high 40s to low 50s in terms of MPG, which is pretty decent for this class of motorcycle, that, 600, 650. With its 3.3 gallon tank, you could stretch the range to maybe 150 miles between fill-ups, but 120, 110 miles is probably a lot more comfortable. And again, this isn't a touring bike by any means, but truthfully that range isn't bad for sort of a normal standard bike either. And speaking of fuel, that brings me to one persistent niggle that my friend, the owner of this bike, has actually had with it. The fuel level sending unit is absolutely crap. It reads empty when it's actually at half a tank, it's inconsistent even at the best of times. And this is a known issue with other GT650s, but unless it's been remedied in the 22 model, which I haven't heard anything about, it is something to look out for in your initial rides on this bike if you buy one. As we get out onto this slightly faster section of road, I want to revisit the suspension and handling. I mentioned that this is a much more comfort-oriented bike, and I stand by that. If you're planning on pushing this motorcycle through turns, honestly, I'd recommend that you just don't. It's a really fun bike to carve a canyon on, but you have to stay well within the limits of its performance to really enjoy it. Push too hard into a corner, and you will not come out the other side with clean underwear. Because the Enfield weighs almost 480 pounds, wet and ready to ride, it tends to sort of push ahead into a corner, which is a really unpleasant feeling. The suspension is also pretty soft, which does make it comfortable, but it also means it doesn't settle into a corner very well. It tends to feel a little wobbly at anything more than a moderate lean angle. And just, all of this you should take with a grain of salt, because this is by no means a bad bike. In fact, it's a bike that I really like. And as long as you're willing to take things a little bit slower, you can have a lot of fun with it. It is bitterly cold here in the great state of Colorado, so I am turning around here and heading back home. And there, actually, we see one of my few actual problems with this bike. I lugged the engine pretty good there because I was in way too high a gear. My fault, obviously, but having a gear indicator somewhere would be such a big quality of life improvement. And, obviously, this is still a budget bike, so I kind of get it. But you have to wonder how much extra it would have cost Royal Enfield to implement one. As I begin the journey back home, I want to bring up one of the huge selling points of this bike, which are its stunning good looks. This is a very handsome bike, and I think especially in this stunning Ventura blue with the white stripes. It's classically styled with that big round headlight out front, twin analog gauges, and subtle nods to RE's long history sprinkled throughout. Let's face it, riding a motorcycle isn't something you do because it's practical. There's always going to be an element of style, and maybe even a little bit of vanity in that decision. And this is a bike that you can look cool and classy riding just about anywhere you go. Speaking of how you look and how you feel, let's talk a little bit about the riding position on this bike. You sit pretty upright, but with a definite bend forward because of the raised clip-ons that replace a conventional handlebar. It's not a particularly committed position because your feet remain pretty low on the bike on their pegs, and you're not folded up like a sport bike rider, but you do concede a bit of comfort as compared to its sister bike, the Interceptor 650, which does actually have that sort of flatter handlebar setup. However, you also get the cooler cafe racer-esque styling, which in my book is a fair trade-off for a bike that's probably not going to see really long days in the saddle. The seat is perfectly comfortable, and it's pretty much just a conventional flat bench. There's plenty of space for a passenger if you want to ride two up, but the extra weight of a second person makes this already heavy bike feel absolutely ponderous and almost difficult to handle. I'm reminded now, because again it is freezing here today, that the GT does not have heated grips, and nor does it have pretty much any tech features at all beyond ABS. It is a basic bike, and that's okay, even if it does limit your riding season a tiny bit more in cold places, as it is limiting my ride today. My legs, however, are being kept fairly warm by that big twin down there, which puts out a fair amount of heat. I'm actually pretty thankful for it today with the cold weather and all, but it's something to keep in mind if you live in a warmer place. So, as I make this last major turn of my route, what are my overall impressions of the bike? Well, overall pretty positive, actually. I'm not without my complaints, most of which I mentioned during this video, but there's very little that I think isn't justified by its comparatively low price tag. And that brings me to some of the other reviewers who've looked at this bike and found it lacking. Yummy Noob in particular I know isn't a big fan, and a lot of other journalists have their share of issues as well. And I think it's fair to point out that most of them have many hundreds, if not many thousands of hours on a motorcycle. And you, if you're buying this as a first bike, don't. So will you be just as disappointed by it as they were? Well, as a novice rider myself, I wouldn't say so. It's not a rocket ship, nor is it the best handling bike I've ever ridden, and nor is it packed with features. But boy is it charming. It puts a smile on my face every time I climb aboard, and whatever its flaws, it's a good bike, especially for the price you get it for. And it may not be your forever motorcycle if you buy this as a first bike, but you probably won't grow out of it as fast as something like a Gixxer 250 or another 300 class bike. I would have no qualms about going out tomorrow and buying this GT650.